Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
And welcome back. Access to Democracy returns. Alan Miller with you. And a return guest, always an interesting guest, Dane Smith, the president of Growth and Justice, a local progressive think tank. And we really have some interesting things to talk about today. As I was looking at the opening, and I thought how important Al Franken and Amy Klobuchar have been to the United States government, even in the last 2 weeks, with this Jeff Sessions Attorney General fiasco that we are enduring, and how lucky we are to have two people of that caliber that are really in the mix. And
yeah, I think they are. I used to be a Washington reporter for the Knight Ridder newspapers and for the St. Paul Pioneer Press years ago, and so I've witnessed our congressional delegation over many years. There have been some better than average quality, Republicans and Democrats, that Minnesota has sent. And I really do think that this tandem, Klobuchar and Franken, is considered one of the strongest that we've had.
In the country, as far as I am concerned, two people of really high quality.
Right, they do their homework.
Dedication.
They're effective. And fairly popular. They also have an incredible sense of humor. Both of them do.
Yes, they do.
In fact, when Obama was at the White House press dinner I think it was a couple of years ago, Klobuchar got so many laughs that I remember President Obama got up and said, "Who would have thought that the founder of Saturday Night Live, which is Al Franken, would be the second funniest senator from Minnesota?"
And, of course, the correspondence dinner, which is really for the president, this year will operate without him being president. And that's interesting, but we're not going to get off on a Trump tangent now because we'll lose an hour.
We have some constructive things to talk about.
Now, Growth and Justice, along with several other organizations, is involved at the moment in the Rural Equity Project, the Minnesota Rural Equity Project. Right. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about what that is, and then let's dissect it and take it apart piece by piece.
All right. Well, we began thinking about this more than a year ago. We were looking at data and have been studying statistics for some time at Growth and Justice that show what became really obvious after the last election, and that is a divide, a disparity between economic condition in rural America, and this applies to Minnesota too. We're part of the country. We began to see big differences in median income, in poverty rates, and widening inequality within rural areas. A few wealthy landowners and lots of folks in poverty. So we've been tracking this for a while, and we were beginning to see evidence that this was affecting Minnesota as a whole in a detrimental way. And if there was one thing that the election of 2016 pointed out or really revealed, it was the depth of this division politically. I mean, the Trump election is, he said, and his critics agree, was a protest vote, and it broke along regional lines. So no matter what you think about the outcome, we've got to do something about it.
It was really despair in outer Minnesota.
Right.
Areas that have traditionally voted Democratic for decades did not this time.
Right.
Some people stayed home, sat on their hands. Others crossed over and voted for Trump.
Right.
And it certainly was heard loud and clear.
Right. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, this has to be addressed. If you're a Republican, you've got to deliver the goods to these folks who said we're being left behind. And if you're a Democrat and you're part of a party that traditionally has appealed to people who are struggling and challenging, or being challenged, or on the low end of the totem pole, you've got to figure out how to get them back. So really it is a bipartisan challenge to figure out exactly what greater Minnesota, rural Minnesota needs, how the economy can be stimulated, how we can revitalize communities, and how we can reduce economic inequality and racial disparity. And this last thing, racial disparity, is really important. There's sort of an assumption that rural America and rural Minnesota is white and metro Minnesota is diverse. That's simply becoming less true all the time. Cities like Worthington and Austin and Pelican Rapids and St. Cloud and Rochester and even northern Minnesota cities, Duluth, are becoming much more diverse. And so the problems and the challenges and the opportunity represented by diversity that we tend to think of as a city situation is really a rural and greater Minnesota situation too.
And a lot of it has to do with the availability not only of high-speed internet, but has to do with educational availability,
Right.
transportation and infrastructure, which is really, really important. Training of people to hold down jobs. Now, I know that we were recently, Sharon and I were recently in St. Cloud, and when we toured the police station there with Chief Anderson.
Yes,
and
who's from here,
yes,
this area, right, Dakota
right.
County. An African-American graduate of Inver Hills Community College. Experience in Dakota County, is now leading the St. Cloud.
Outstanding policeman and
Right.
so revered by his
Right.
entire force. That was amazing.
A great example of what
But
the kind of
St.
leadership we need.
St. Cloud, which used to be in a derogatory sense called White Cloud, is not that anymore. It's a
Right.
very diverse community.
Exactly.
And they have 4 colleges in or about the area.
Right.
But they have to train the people for the jobs, because manufacturers are calling for high-tech people, trained people,
Right.
and they're not available. Jobs are vacant.
This mismatch exists throughout the state between too large a group of people who are undereducated today's workforce, and therefore underemployed or even unemployed. And on the other side, this big problem with a shortage of skilled workers. I mean, you got unrealized human potential here. You've got a demand for those skills here, and we really simply have to. That is a number one policy concern for Minnesota.
And you have youth,
right? You got
who
youth
are not really being trained properly.
Right.
The result of which, and just yesterday, Department of Homeland Security, a report was leaked which said it's not, terrorists are not coming into the country from Muslim countries.
They're being created.
What's happened, they're being created here
Right.
by youth who are being misled, not educated sufficiently,
Right.
and by our own people also, people who are native here. We've got to get rid of those prejudices. We have to educate these people, and we have to make the facilities available to them.
Yes. And at Growth and Justice, we've done quite a bit of work explaining the details and the how, as you often put it. How do we do it is the way you always lead off this show. And these new emerging career pathways that are being advanced and developed in northern Minnesota and southern Minnesota, Mayo Clinic and elsewhere, are really getting at this situation. They are providing credentials in just a few months into nursing, into manufacturing, into construction jobs, so that people get that crucial first piece of paper that shows they're qualified to do some post-high school kind of work. And this is just one of a dozen things that we think our legislature can get to work on right away and approve in this session that will bring at least some improvement to the condition of rural and greater Minnesota.
We talked about transportation, and one of the things that really is befuddling to me is that we have about $800 million available from the federal government to create a new light rail line. Now, we've created two lines that are incredibly successful, particularly the blue line, now the green line. Well, what would have been the red line, the money is there from the federal government. The contribution from the state is minimal compared to what the feds are giving us. And there would be, seem to me, no reason not to go forward with it, particularly where we have a bigger surplus than we anticipated, to take 100 or 150 million of that very large surplus and put it into the light rail, again, making transportation available for people to go to jobs.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. In an op-ed in the Star Tribune last August, we seized on that problem because that literally, I use the word derailed, that derailed the last legislative session. The opposition by rural legislators to a metro system, kind of ginning up, fanning rural resentment against the Twin Cities, is the main reason that we got nothing out of the last legislative session. We think that's wrong-headed. We point out how there are people in the business community, which is normally aligned with Republican interests. Most of the business leadership in this state favored that light rail expansion and still does.
I think even the Chamber of Commerce, if I'm
Right.
not mistaken.
Absolutely, pretty much across the board. And for political reasons, the resentment against the light rail system continues in the legislature, and we think that it's a big mistake, that we're not going to get ahead in this state by
Makes no sense.
by robbing St. Paul to pay St. Peter, as has often been put over the years. And we really need a one Minnesota mentality around our public policy. And the Center for Rural and Policy Development, a really respected research group, recently did a piece pointing out that sort of implying that instead of attacking metro transit projects, Greater Minnesota needs mobility. In other words, that's the word for transit in Greater Minnesota. They need rides to the nurse,
Wherever they're
to and from
working,
the nursing
right,
home.
yeah.
An increasing percentage of Greater Minnesota is older, is not going to be able to drive. Rather than railing against urban transit, metro or rural and Greater Minnesota legislators need to get behind their own mobility plans and push for investment that matches the rural or the metro dollars.
Well, in your equity program, one of the things that jumped out at me as really shocking was in the driver diversion project,
Right.
that 1 in 10 people with licenses in Minnesota have their licenses either revoked or put on hold for a variety of reasons. Yeah, we know that people have warrants out against them, but people who didn't pay fines and lose their licenses.
Right.
And there was a way around this. Now, I don't know what the legislature has done with it, but
This is a classic example. The driver diversion program is a way for you to continue to hold a license and drive because you've worked out a plan to repay your fines. This is a major reason for driver's license suspension, is simply not paying your fines and fees. It wouldn't apply to people who are a threat to public safety because of drunk driving and so forth. But this driver diversion program is something that's widely available now in the metro area, but it's not available in rural counties. So this is one of a
and
dozen.
why not? That makes no sense.
It takes extra staff and dollars to administer these programs. And so this is just one example of a number of small creative things that we can do to give a boost to Greater Minnesota or level the playing field a little bit for folks out there.
And another thing that you point out in this study, which is really very comprehensive and very exhaustive, is the fact that we need early childhood care and education. It's one of the points, because if someone is restricted to the home, be it mother or father, because they can't get to a job, if in fact we had facilities available, and I know the governor just proposed a big chunk of money for this, I think 34 million if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Probably not enough, but at least to get it going. And yet he meets resistance.
Yeah.
It makes no sense to me.
Yes, Early Childhood and Child Care Assistance Program, sliding fee help for working mothers so that they can more easily afford child care is a big part of our dozen proposals for the priorities for this legislature. The early childhood education system has been improving in rural Minnesota. This is access to high-quality parenting classes and stimulation and development for very young children, especially in low-income families.
And there
we
are
know
a lot
the payoff on this is just enormous.
A lot of factories up in Greater Minnesota where the people are not necessarily Native Americans, and by that I mean not necessarily Native Americans per se, but they're not born here. They're people who immigrated here, and we have to serve their needs to help all of us. And yet, and another thing that I wanted to talk about was the farm tax program, tax relief for farms. You have some really shocking statistics in that regard.
Yes, well, there's a number of tax proposals in our set of policy priorities for this year that help Greater Minnesota. One is working family tax credit, which puts tens of millions of dollars right into the pockets of working low-income families. This is a mechanism that is replicated in the federal government through the Earned Income Tax Credit. It is easy to administer. It's one of the most effective ways to make sure that folks simply who are working have a better standard of living. This money goes right into the local merchants' coffers because low-income people tend to spend their money on groceries and paying their bills. So that's a key thing. The second tax provision is a credit to build affordable housing. In many greater Minnesota cities, rural outstate cities, manufacturing plants are growing and hiring people, but they simply don't have a place to live because the market is not working out there. And so we need incentives to build more middle-income workforce housing.
And we need something to help the small family farmers who are becoming fewer and fewer while their taxes are going up disproportionately to what they can afford.
The real important thing about the tax reductions that Governor Dayton has proposed for farms has not so much to do with big and small farmers, because it would apply to all ag land, but it would take the pressure off farmers who are voting against school levy referendums because it hikes their taxes up so much. So if the state assumes more of that burden, we're hoping that it means that farmers will be voting for the new school facilities that the increasingly diverse communities need to fill the growth. And in Worthington, more than half the population, 66% of the kids now in the Worthington schools, way out there in the prairies by Iowa and South Dakota, are kids of color. As high a percentage as we have right here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And a combination of perhaps, as much as we are afraid to say it, white resentment, and a combination of worry about taxes meant that a badly needed school referendum went down in flames just this last November. So we've got to address that.
And it's really, again, it's the same thing that happened in my mind that gave us President Trump. People voted against their own interest by way of protest. And that would be a typical example of Worthington levy, which would have helped the entire community, not just the minority community, but the people who are doing manufacturing and other jobs. And again, I blame a lot of the legislators for rather really living on their prejudices and running as candidates on the prejudices instead of explaining the logical and intelligent conclusion.
Well, I've been a political observer trying to sort through the why of elections for more than 40 years now. And this one is complicated. This is one of the most complex elections I think we've ever seen. A lot of commentators say that it's one of those that will go down in history as some sort of turning point. Which kind of turn, we don't know. But we're a C3 nonpartisan organization at Growth and Justice. We don't endorse candidates. We typically don't talk in partisan language. But I will say that I think to the degree that Trump's victory was due to resentment and hatred or fear of foreigners and people of color, we need to reject that. But to the degree that it was driven by an authentic, legitimate concern for a decline in the local community and this inequality that has been a fact of life now for too many years, we need to embrace that.
People see their way of life challenged.
Right.
Everybody wants their children to do better than the generation before.
Exactly.
And what they see is really obstacles so that the children don't have as much to look forward to as the current adult generation. And that's what I think fueled a lot of that vote.
Sure.
Which we can overcome assuming that we're not all speaking Russian in 4 years. But
Right. Well, that's an interesting turnabout, too. For years, it was the Republicans who stoked worries about Mother Russia, and now it's a little different. A little away from my area of expertise. But
mine too, other than the fact that my grandparents on my father's side fled Russia.
well, I grew up in Alaska, so I could see Russia from my house.
Well, that's good. So you must be near Sarah then.
That's right. Yes, I think returning to the Rural Equity Project, I really think that what we've tried to do here, almost everything in this list of a dozen policy priorities for this legislature in the here and now, right now, has Republican support. This is good, solid, constructive policy that has strong rural support already, and it has bipartisan support.
And
so that's one important point I want to make. And the other point is it really is broken into two kinds of policy. One is physical infrastructure. You mentioned broadband earlier.
Yes, that was the next thing I was
I want
going
to talk
bring
about
up.
that a little bit. But it provides transportation, clean water systems for city governments. These water systems, both wastewater and clean water for drinking, are badly deteriorated. We've got to put some money into improving that essential infrastructure ingredient, foundation for everything. The other set of policies are what we call human capital. And this has to do with education, the career pathways we've talked about, early childhood, some of the tax policies that puts dollars into the pockets of low-income working folks. So it's human capital, physical infrastructure. And on that physical infrastructure side, the broadband really is important. You cannot be part of the economy if you don't have high-speed internet anymore. We know this.
And it's also a great educational really device, if I can use
Right.
that word, for people who are not necessarily close to learning centers to take the advantage of those learning centers in
Right.
so many ways. And we're actually down to less than a minute.
Okay.
So where can people read up on these proposals and contact you at Growth and Justice if they want to contribute somehow?
Well, check out our main page. It's www.growthandjustice.org. That's our website. Displayed prominently on the webpage is our Minnesota Rural Equity Project, our 4-page document that has a statement and a sort of a listing, along with lots of hyperlinks to these policies from broadband to early childhood education that really will serve the cause of a one Minnesota policy
And we've been talking
framework
with
for Minnesota.
Dane Smith, president of Growth and Justice. Always, we run out of time. Thanks so much.
Great to see you again, Alan.